Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished speakers, dear Isabel and Elias Enderlein, Henrik's family, dear friends and guests of the Hertie School. My name is Cornelia Woll, and it's my privilege to welcome you here tonight as we mark the first Henrik Enderlein Fellowship Lecture and simultaneously seize the opportunity to present you the second recipient of the Henrik Enderlein Distinguished Fellowship through a panel discussion on the future of Europe. With this fellowship, we continue to celebrate the legacy of our dear colleague and friend, President of the Hertie School and Director of the Jacques Delors Center, Henrik Enderlein. Henrik was a tireless supporter of European integration and committed to research at the service of society, advocating for the potential transformative impact of scientific insight on policymaking. In that spirit, the Henrik Enderlein Distinguished Fellowship offers scholars an opportunity to conduct research at the Hertie School for 9 months. To be considered, the researcher must be dedicated to promoting the exchange between policymakers and academics and tackling the most pressing challenges facing Germany and Europe today. In addition to connecting with our world-class researchers at the Hertie School Centers of Competence, the Enderlein Fellowship holder also participates in teaching, which is possibly the most important contribution we can make as a university to shape the future of policymaking. None of this would be possible without our partners at the Stiftung Mercator, and I would like to thank the Stiftung and Almut Wieland-Karimi, a member of the Advisory Council who is here with us today, for their generous support for this important initiative in Henrik's memory. Before looking forward and introducing the second Enderlein Fellow, I would like to take a minute to look back and present somebody who may not need an introduction anymore, but will get one anyway, Dr. Johannes Lindner, our first fellowship holder and the speaker for today's lecture. Johannes joined the Hertie School last year, following a distinguished career of 2 decades at the European Central Bank. And if you're calculating, that is pretty much the age of the European Central Bank. During most of the time, he has been in the machinery room of the institution building that is at the heart of the European project. I had the privilege to meet Johannes even before, when he was in the process of finishing a dense doctoral dissertation at Oxford University about EU budgetary politics. At the time, I had never met anybody who worked on EU budgetary politics, and I thought, what a peripheral subject, of interest possibly to a small group of experts. Now, this shows you not only that I know very little, but also how much budgetary and fiscal Europe has moved into the center of debate. And I would venture as much as saying that really the question of who pays for what, when, where, and how, to paraphrase Laswell, is certainly at the heart of what politics is all about. So we are very happy to have Johannes's expertise with us, and I will also share that to this date, I still meet with colleagues who say that Johannes's work is one of the only sensible studies addressing this crucial piece in European integration and for fiscal Europe. I suspect that since these days, Johannes, possibly secretly, had hoped to combine his growing policy expertise with the academic luxury of deep thinking and the transmission of knowledge to future generations. The Henrik Enderlein Fellowship gave him precisely this opportunity, and I'm thrilled that we could welcome him into the Hertie School community. In addition to his research and teaching, Johannes has taken up the co-directorship of the Jacques Delors Center, leading the center's think tank activities with the drive and enthusiasm he shares with Henrik. I'm incredibly pleased that this lecture is not a goodbye, as Johannes will continue his work co-directing the Jacques Delors Center. Johannes, thank you so much for the wonderful work you've done this past year. Looking forward, we're excited to welcome another distinguished fellow who also has shared memories and convictions with Henrik. Please allow me to not just say welcome to Beza Shahini, but instead welcome back. Beza was part of our MPP graduating class of 2009. And since graduating from the Hertie School, Beza has had an illustrious career in civil society, academia, and government, which you will learn about in a minute, not from me, but from the speaker following me. We are thrilled that Beza will bring this expertise to us as she spends her year researching EU integration and enlargement to the Western Balkans alongside colleagues at the Jacques Delors Center. Beza, as you start your Henrik Enderlein Distinguished Fellowship, I'm sure that you have many ideas, and to help you with putting them down, we wanted to give you a small gift, a notebook. This is an idea from your predecessor, Johannes, as the notebook is also a tribute to Henrik, who also carried one with him to ensure that he never lost any of his ideas. We hope that you too will fill the pages with your ideas and memories during your stay with us, and I'm already looking forward to hearing your thoughts during the lecture you will prepare 1 year from now. Now, we're honored and grateful that Dr. Anton Hofreiter, a member of the Bundestag for the Greens, former co-chair of the Greens parliamentary group, and the current chair of the Committee on European Union Affairs, has accepted to engage with both of you in a panel discussion on the question of a stronger Europe. What needs to change for a deeper and wider Europe to function? This is the question we will ask today in our panel discussion, which will be moderated by Céline Boutelet from Le Monde, where she's the Berlin-based correspondent with an expertise on the economy and many other topics as well. Thank you very much for participating in this. I'm looking forward to a lively debate on European integration, on the necessary changes we need to make the EU fit to tackle the complex challenges we currently face. Before we hear from Johannes and open the panel, I would first like to welcome Almut Wieland-Karimi on stage to say a few words about the fellowship and about Beza Shahini. Almut, the floor is yours.
Dear Cornelia Woll, dear Johannes Lindner, dear Beza Shahini, dear guests, it is my pleasure to welcome you on behalf of the Stiftung Mercator. I am a member of the advisory board of the Stiftung, and at the same time I'm a member of the advisory board of the UN Peacebuilding Fund, and I used to be the head of the Center for International Peace Operations, which one of the other might know, which is a government organization which belongs to the Federal Foreign Office. As Mercator is a private, independent, and non-profit organization, we feel really honored to support the Henrik Enderlein Fellowship. We work on 4 big topics. One is Europe in the world, the European integration. The second one is climate change and how to internationally cooperate. Third one is digitization, and the last one is participation and inclusive societies. Talking about these issues, for us, one very important topic is the European integration and also the perspective for the Western Balkans to become a member of the European Union. And I will talk about Beza in a moment, but I think it very much fits our program as well, the research you are going to do with support of this fellowship. But let me first talk about the fellowship. As you all know, it's a Hertie School Fellowship funded by the Mercator Foundation. It's called Henrik Enderlein, as you already have outlined, because he was a committed, outstanding European. He was committed to a better integration of the European Union, bringing a lot of ideas, and therefore we think it's a perfect tool to kind of follow up his ideas and to support what he has been doing. So we're happy that also we are kind of officially opening this fellowship to the public, or maybe you're all people who work with the Hertie School, I don't know that, but it's the first time that we really talk about this fellowship, and we are very proud of it. And his vision was really strengthening the European integration, and we know that the challenges grow by the day. We all know about the world order which is changing. We might also talk about a world in disorder. And there are the big questions about what role should the European Union play, or what role can the European Union play? And in order to play a role, of course, we need the integration of the European Union with all its challenges. I'm not going to name, but I'm sure we'll learn about many of them when we listen to Johannes Lindner's speech and to the panel afterwards. As we are bidding farewell to the first Henrik Enderlein Fellow, Johannes Lindner, today, who will give his Enderlein lecture, I'd like to extend a warm welcome to Besa Shahini. I think she is a second perfect Henrik Enderlein Fellow, because the fellowship contributes to the idea of building networks between politics, between academia, civil society, and building bridges between them. Because one of the challenges we have in the European Union are these silos we are working in, and we need people who are bridge builders. So Besa is definitely one of them. She's still a young person, I can say that. But if you read her CV or read her bio, you would think she is a retiree, outstanding personality, WH. So I was really impressed learning more about your achievements. You have worked in many think tanks, you even built up think tanks in different cities. In Tbilisi, I remember, in Berlin, in Pristina, I guess. You have been the minister and deputy minister of sports and culture and youth in Albania, and education. I forgot that, you see. And she has worked in different fields. That is also important. She's worked a lot on education and modern tools of education, blended learning. She even built a TV channel. I read that. But you also have been a civil society activist and worked in think tanks, especially on the European integration. And all these questions you will also tackle now. And so we're really proud to have you as a fellow. And we're looking forward, no pressure, to your lecture next year with all you will have been learned, or you will be learning during this year. So a warm welcome. And I can say on behalf of Stiftung Mercator, I guess on behalf of the Hertie School as well, any support you need, we are there. Any contacts you need, networks, conferences, whatever, we're happy to support you on that. And we are really looking forward to having you as a fellow. But without further ado, Johannes Lindner, your Henrik Enderlein lecture. Thank you.
Dear Cornelia, dear Ms. Wieland-Karimi, dear Besa, dear Anton Hofreiter, dear Celine. Last Wednesday, Henrik would have turned 49. There have been many moments since his death where I've asked myself, what would Henrik's advice have been now? What would he have done? Since his death, his loss is dearly felt. In my lecture today, I want to take Henrik's work and apply it to the challenges we face today. I want to look back at the 12 months that I spent here at the Hertie School as Henrik Enderlein Fellow. And in a nutshell, I want to argue that the challenges that the EU faces at the moment create an inbuilt tension with its own capacity to act. And that the EU budget, maybe not such a surprise after what Cornelia said, the EU budget is a central instrument in that, and we need to develop this EU budget further together with institutional reform. And in doing so, we need Germany to take on further responsibility and to lead this debate. I'll be developing these points briefly, and then I'm looking forward to the discussion at the panel on this. But let me start with Henrik's approach. Henrik and I were the same age. We first met at a 2-week student academy near Constance. He was a student at Sciences Po in Paris. And had he not gone to Paris, he would have chosen the same program, Economics with Politics, at the University of Cologne that I attended, he told me. Not only did we get on well and kept in touch, but this theme of common places and common interest continued. When I left Cologne and the Max Planck Institute to start my PhD studies in Oxford, he came to Cologne for his PhD there. When I looked for a job at an EU institutions, he was at the ECB already and it told me to apply, which when I finally came then, he was already on his way to Berlin to join academia. Years later, at the height of the Euro crisis, when I became head of EU institutions, the division that coordinated the relations with the finance ministers and with the parliament, he was already established as a key voice on how to fix economic and monetary union. And it was then that I realized the congenial mix of talents that Henrik had. And I would like to explain that in 3 elements. First, one size fits none. Earlier than most, Henrik had understood what fundamental shift it was to introduce the euro and a centralized monetary policy with the ECB in a world with decentralized national economic policy making. And one size fits none was the powerful message from his doctoral thesis in 2002, which showed that the adjustment burden in economic and monetary union would fall on national economic policy making at the national level, and that this would create distributive tensions and instabilities. And the subsequent euro crisis was exactly that. So the first element of Henrik's approach is to understand the inbuilt tensions and weaknesses of the institutional setup. Second, a roadmap. What needs to be done to fix the problems? What are the workable reform proposals and steps to achieve them? Henrik's political economy approach was a mix of realpolitik and a vision for Europe and a good understanding of market dynamics. His analysis evolved over time as the crisis moved on. He developed different ideas for a central fiscal capacity, several roadmaps, or convergent processes. So the second key element is to develop concrete and realistic reform proposals. The third is policy entrepreneur. The best reform proposals will not succeed if they're not supported and pursued by key policy players. Henrik saw Franco-German cooperation and friendship as the essential engine to bring Europe ahead and to solve the crisis. He was best placed to bring the two sides together and acted tirelessly as policy entrepreneur, both in Berlin here and in Paris, both among policy actors as well as academics and policy advisors. And creating the Jacques Delors Center was part of that strategy as the sister to the Jacques Delors Institute in Paris. So the third and final element of the Henrik Enderlein approach is to build alliances. And let me now take this approach to the situation we are facing at the moment. And my key argument for this first part, understand the inbuilt tensions and weaknesses, is the following. Climate change, the pandemic, US-Chinese rivalry, the war in Ukraine have shifted the global order in a way that seriously challenges the European Union and its current setup. It makes the economic and political security concerns much more central, and it strengthened the state as a key actor within the economy. So much more focus on security, and the state a much stronger actor within the economy. Now, supranational solutions should become more relevant, yet the open market approach, the focus on regulation that marks out the European Union is challenged by this new focus on security and on the state as a strong economic actor. Because the Union lacks the institutional capacity and the financial means to take such a course and to have security in a much more with a much more central focus, and to take a stronger role as state in the economy. And the instability and tension that this imply are not dissimilar to what Henrik described for the Economic and Monetary Union. So this is the complex argument that I want to unpack a little bit with you now. And I would want to take the Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA, to illustrate that. And I'm taking this because this was one of the first key events that took place when I took on the fellowship. And it's also something that we at the Jacques Delors Center did quite a lot of work on, and in particular Niels Redeker, Yannick Jansen, and Philipp Jäger. So what does the IRA stand for? It stands for the fact climate change is recognized by the US as a key challenge, as one that needs to be addressed by significant public investment. Rather than carbon pricing, positive incentives through massive industrial support, policy support is applied. Second, green and clean technology are seen as key for the resilience and the competitiveness of the US economy. There's a strong protectionist element in that. And the aim is to keep industry in the US. It's clearly directed against China as a major economic and political rival, and as an economic actor that itself applies massive subsidies and is very active in its industrial policy. And thirdly, there is a social motivation, a focus on creating good jobs, especially in regions of voters that have voted for Trump. And in fact, in some of the calculations have said that there are about 170,000 jobs created, and in particular in regions that actually have had Republican majorities before. And finally, it's massive in size. It's uncapped with a direct impact through the tax breaks, and it's coupled together with other programs like the CHIPS Act, like the Infrastructure Act, and has therefore a strong macroeconomic effect. Now, what does that mean for the European Union? It creates tensions between the economic and political challenges the Union faces and its institutional and financial capacity. This is not completely sudden, but it intensifies its inbuilt weaknesses. Let me quickly look back. And the students, and I see some of my students here, and I'm glad that you are here, will probably know this from the classes that we did. But let me quickly look back on what is the nature of economic integration, has been the nature of economic integration. The European Union has been built around the notion that economic integration brings peace and prosperity. And in particular in the 1990s, this was very much in sync with the global order and the concept of economic openness with a rule-based open global order sustained by international institution and economic growth, the so-called Washington Consensus. The main instrument of the Union was market making regulation, which was also a means to exercise power globally by being the international standard setter. Economic policies were loosely, in a non-binding way, coordinated. State aid rules was a key instrument to ensure a level playing field within the single market. And the budget was relatively small. Now, the first shift came with the financial and euro crisis, as we already mentioned. Reluctantly, there was more fiscal and financial integration. The second big shift came with the pandemic, with the Next Generation EU program, which was a massive fiscal program that supported and created national fiscal space and was coupled with national reform programs. But it's temporary and designed as a one-off crisis measure. Now, the question is, how does this union now react to the challenge that I illustrated with the IRA as an example? So react to more prominence of security concerns and a more interventionist industrial policy. One part, it fights back on the subsidy race, on the protectionist trend. It argues for higher carbon price worldwide and for keeping up the rule-based order. And that's very laudable. It's sort of the instinct of keeping the global order intact. But it also tries to reply in kind. And here is where the problem starts. So it enacts very ambitious targets for developing the green technology, for moving to renewable energies, and for developing the chip industries. But it does not have the common financial instruments and the governance to implement this. And the Net Zero Industry Act and the Critical Raw Material Act, for example, they have very aspirational objectives, but they leave the implementation largely to the national level. Now, of course, there could be a legitimate debate on what is the best type of European industrial policy, but this is not really taking place or has died down. Originally, the Commission President has announced a sovereignty fund, but what instead it was proposed subsequently was a STEP program, S-T-E-P, and the name says it, it's really just a step. It's 10 billion in size. Now, with the Next Generation EU still ongoing, there's very little appetite and strong resistance against discussing new EU money. Instead, the Union has relaxed state aid rules. In fact, industrial policies are done nationally in those countries that have the financial means to do so or think that they have the financial means. This is very much coordinated with very, very limited governance to come with. So Germany has recently announced 10 billion subsidies for Intel to set up a microchip plant in Magdeburg. This leaves other member states behind and the single market fragmented. The full potential of the single market, I would argue, in terms of scale and scope, is insufficiently used. The supranational challenges are addressed nationally. Let me add another example that illustrates this inbuilt tensions and weaknesses, and that goes beyond the economic policy. It's the discussion on enlargement. So with the Ukraine war, the approach towards enlargement has changed. The Commission President and others have sent a clear signal to the Western Balkan countries and Ukraine and Moldova that EU accession will come. Yet the institutional readiness of the Union and the ability to mention an enormous increase in economic and political heterogeneity is not yet addressed. And in a union of 30 plus, the ability to agree on common financial solutions will be even harder. So this is the first element, so the inbuilt tensions and weaknesses that I see in the institutional setup. So what can we do to address this? And here, allow me to turn to the former ECB president, Mario Draghi, who in a public lecture and then in The Economist brought fiscal union back on the policy agenda. And he makes two important points. The first point, he sees the same inbuilt tensions and weaknesses I described above, and I quote him, "Europe must now confront a host of supranational challenges that will require vast investments in a short time frame, including defense, as well as green transition and digitalization. Contrary to the euro area, he argues, the case for fiscal capacity is about symmetric shocks and common challenges that require union-wide responses. It's not about redistributive transfers for stabilizing the economy, but about putting parts of the national expenditure to the European level. So aligning some of the expenditure with the regulatory responsibility that we already see that the Union has, putting the fiscal policy where it could be more effective at a level where the scope and scale of the single market can be fully used. That's the first point. The second point he makes is that moving to a bigger EU budget cannot be done through technocratic integration. And that's remarkable coming from a central banker, an ECB president, but maybe that's more his experience as an Italian prime minister that comes through. These are political choices and they require treaty change. I quote, "Such reforms would mean pooling more sovereignty and would therefore require new forms of representation and centralized decision-making." While Draghi sees the challenges in getting an agreement on a bigger budget and a reform treaty at the current juncture, and that's important, he's optimistic on the citizens' support for this. He is convinced that the status quo is not viable And once citizens have understood that the status quo is not viable, they are more willing and they want, in fact, Europe to provide effective solutions and preserve prosperity and security. Thus, he combines the discussion on the EU budget with the discussion on institutional reform. And let me quickly take these 2 points, institutional reform and budget, in turn. So on institutional reform, it's important, in my view, to combine the opening of the accession negotiations with Ukraine and Moldova with a commitment to review the current treaty. And today, this afternoon, we had an important presentation of a report by the French-German expert group. Some of you may have seen this already in the media. And my colleague Tu Nguyen from the Jacques Delors Center is part of that group. And it presents a good overview of institutional reform proposals to make the Union enlargement ready. It also includes proposals for the institution making of the EU budget. And it reflects some of the work that Tu and myself have done over the last month. And it includes majority voting on spending decisions, more flexibility, a reform of the own resources system, and the ability to issue debt. Now, the second is the content of the budget. And here, we're really getting into the connoisseurship of the budget. It's the MFF. Again, some of the students that did my course know what it is, but many others may not. But it's fundamental to the budget and the politics around the EU budget. It's the multi-annual financial framework that has the 7-year core set of the EU budget. Now, it's adopted by unanimity and usually doesn't change much. So incrementalism is the rule of the game. Now, for next time, which is 2028, when the new financial multi-annual financial framework, MFF, has to be in place, it's different. Because we have to repay the debt for the next generation EU. We have to probably absorb much of the rebuilding costs for Ukraine, and we have to anticipate some of the costs that will come by including new members into the Union. This means the logic of incrementalism will not continue. It means there's additional pressure, but that's an opportunity to really reset the budget and to ask what type of budget we as a union want. Now, Draghi does not provide sort of the concrete reform proposals a la Henrik Enderlein, that's clear. But he provides a framework by combining institutional reform and the EU budget that is useful and could be taken up by us to develop these reform proposals. And I've mentioned the group as well as some of our own work. What is the aim is that by 2028, so by the beginning of the new MFF, and by the last full year of the then European Parliament and the Commission, because you know the next European elections will then be in 29, that by then we have an agreement on how to make the Union ready for its supranational challenges and ready for enlargement. And there's an important additional dimension, which is the readiness of the accession countries as well. And I'm really glad that Beza Shahini will join the Jacques Delors Center and will work on this very important topic. Now, let's come shortly to the final point, which is building alliances. Here, the role of Germany is central. It was also the reason that I came to Berlin, because from the Frankfurt and Brussels perspective at the ECB, I'd always seen how important Germany was for whether the integration process was stalling or proceeding. And there is an unfortunate ambivalence in Germany about its role in Europe. In an article in Der Spiegel at the beginning of the pandemic, Henrik described this well, and I translate. Germany has constantly, implicitly demanded the role of the economic hegemon in Europe during and after the Euro crisis and the following years, but at the same time has always explicitly rejected it. Henrik, in this article, called for change, for more solidarity. And in fact, shortly after that article, Chancellor Merkel and President Macron made the proposal for the grant-based recovery fund that then led to Next Generation EU. Olaf Scholz seemed to have taken up the same spirit in his famous Zeitenwende speech that he did 3 days after the outbreak of the war in Ukraine. The Chancellor did not only describe the change of era, but it seemed at least he would also announce a new policy, and I quote, "For Germany and for all other EU member states, this means not merely asking what can be extracted for one's own country in Brussels, but asking what is the best decision for the Union." My experience since then, and in particular over the last 12 months here in Berlin, has been sobering. The German government has been either in crisis management mode, seeking to get Germany through the winter with high energy prices, or busy in infighting among coalition partners. Europe doesn't feature in this very prominently. And the relationship with France, despite the many affirmations to the contrary and the institutionalized exchanges at all levels, is not working well. There's neither a common vision for Europe nor concrete joint plans on how to address the most pressing policy issues, from fiscal rules to energy union. And let's see, today's report, of course, is to a certain extent an exception to this. The last economic downturn, which here in Germany has made Germany, in the eyes of some, again, the sick man of Europe, der kranke Mann Europas, could provide an opportunity to rethink. And my colleague Niels Redeker and I wrote today in the Handelsblatt, expressing the hope that Germany could rethink its role and take a more active leadership on many of the European issues. Because many of the problems that Germany faces at the moment, high energy prices, lack of competitiveness, and over-reliance on global trade, can actually be solved and addressed with European solutions and with the reform strategy that I've outlined before. So Germany must assume more responsibility and coordinate closely with its partner, in particular France, and with the EU institutions. And I think time is pressing because we're running into the European elections. This is the place where we can have the debate on these issues, and it leads to the Commission agenda and hopefully the initiation of a process to 2028. Let me conclude and ask again, what would Henrik do? And I think and hope he would agree with the aim of combining substantial reform of the budget with institutional reform. I think he would also agree on setting a clear date with 2028. And I think he would agree to call on key decision makers, such as the chair of the European Affairs Committee in the Bundestag and others, to build alliances and to make Germany take up a leading role in this debate. I would like to thank Cornelia Woll, the Hertie School, and the Mercator Foundation for making me the first Henrik Enderlein Fellow, and for the great pleasure and honor to have been here for the last 12 months. Thank you very much.
Is it working? Yes. Good evening. Good evening, everyone. Vielen Dank. Many thanks, Johannes, for your very interesting presentation. Thank you for mentioning Henrik Enderlein for his role in Franco-German cooperation, which is so sorely missed in the dialogue between Paris and Berlin. I would like to open the debate now, and I invite the participant to join me on the stage. Please, Anton Hofreiter. You have been presented already, member of the German Bundestag, Bundis 90 der Grünen, chairman of the Committee of European Union Affairs. Welcome. Thank you for being here tonight. Thank you. Beza Shahini, Beza Shahini, welcome, a warm welcome. You are former Minister for Education, Youth, Sport of Albania, and you, Henrik Enderlein Fellow, welcome. Thank you for being here tonight. And of course, Johannes Lindner. So, yeah, ladies and gentlemen, the timing of this debate seems particularly appropriate. As Johannes Lindner mentioned, the rapporteurs of a commission of enlargement with 12 experts commissioned a few months ago by France and Germany presented their conclusion to the European Affairs Minister. The report recommends far-reaching reforms in the EU. Anna Luhrmann, Minister of State at the German Foreign Office, said, EU enlargement, EU reforms go hand in hand. That's also what you are advocating, Mr. Lindner. We can discuss that later. But first of all, I would like to invite you, Mr. Hofreiter. So Johannes Lindner has given us a lot of thought. He pointed out that Germany should assume more responsibility for shaping the future together with France and the EU institution in the process of enlarging and deepening the European Union. I would like to ask you your reaction about that. As Johannes thought time is pressing, why is Berlin reluctant to take on this leadership role?
Maybe because of the leadership problems we have in several areas. As I several times said, we have a problem within the country. So I think we have the same problem here also. And there are, on the other hand, really difficult times. And we have a three-party coalition, which is working better than most people see it, but are not working as good as we need in these difficult times. And yeah, I think we need more leadership from, to name it, from Scholz. So that's the main problems, I think, we have, and we have the three parties have very different opinion when it comes to the necessary reforms. When you look to the liberals and compare it with the Social Democrats or with the pro-European part of the Social Democrats, for the liberals, more debts on European level or even fiscal mechanisms on European level are some things they really reject and emotionally reject. And other people, the Greens, and in this case the Social Democrats, are very in favor for it. So it's not easy. And this combination makes it really difficult. And because of this, I always advocate that we don't stick to always very logical reforms, but took every chance we get. And because of this, I would say, yes, it's necessary to reform the European Union, but if you have a chance to enlarge it, and the reforms are not happening very well, we will, despite not having big reforms, we will enlarge it, because I think we have to take every chance we get. And I think in the end, European Union was never built in a way academica or logic would propose it, but it was always when we took chances because of crisis, and then the next crisis came and we took the next chance. Because of this we say never miss a good crisis to deepen and maybe enlarge the European Union. And I think that we should, despite all the problems, can be more optimistic. And I have to admit that we are now 27. If we would have been 29, yeah, it will be more complicated, but it's not a categorical difference. It's not that we are now 6 and then we will be 35. And when people say Ukraine is such a big country with so many people, Ukraine before the war had 44 million people. Great Britain had, I think, 69, 70. So they left us. And of course, Ukraine is larger, but has less people. And one can say European Union was not function with the Brits, but you can also argue it was function. So I think we should be really carefully that with calling for reforms and changing of the treaty, it's not just blocking the geopolitical necessary enlargement. So I always would argue, yes, we need reforms, and yes, we need enlargement, but we should take every chance we get.
So you don't believe in vision? So let me ask you a question. What would be the green definition of leadership?
The green definition of leadership would be that Germany clearly realizes that it's the most powerful country within Europe, accepts this role, and not in a bad way, not in a way now Europe speaks German, as it was announced during the euro crisis, but in accepting it that we have to solve the problems, to help countries to find compromises. But if you don't have this kind of leadership, we still have chances and we take them. Look at how Germany helped Ukraine. I think Scholz was never really in favor of helping Ukraine with weapons, and I fear he still is not, but still we have done it. So I think that's the way we have to do it here also. Put on pressure and find a way in swinging to this way and then to this way. And in the end, the course will be somewhere this.
So expecting for the best and pray maybe. Okay, maybe I will turn to you, Beza Shahini. Albania is a country that has been waiting for almost a decade to join the European Union, and the process has largely stagnated since the economic and financial crisis and the Brexit. Now it seems to be taking off again with the new geopolitical situation linked to the war in Ukraine. So I would like to ask you your point of view about the EU and enlargement from the Western Balkans point of view. But maybe we could start with a vision, your vision as a young lady in your country, dreaming of you. So the capacity to dream or to have a vision, maybe we are not very comfortable with in the old Europe.
Thank you. I've been called young twice tonight, so that's quite good. Look, what is EU enlargement? It's this utter transformation of countries that participate in the accession process, right? As a minister in the Albanian government, I saw firsthand how difficult it is to change any policy, even if it's a small, peripheral, something that is not even controversial. It takes months to make a change despite political will, right? And yet you look at the reforms that countries have to do in order to join the European Union. These are everything, changing the law, the national law, making the European law national law, bringing the standards up on everything, especially on goods and services, processes, all the internal processes, changing all the services that public administration gives to its own people and how it interacts with outside. Impossible, right? Yet countries have delivered one after the other when EU membership was a credible perspective. Yes, Brexit, financial crisis, and then Brexit, and the process kind of lost its way. The reason why it worked so well with previous enlargement waves was that the process was very clear. It's rigorous. The European Commission sets out what countries have to do. It assesses fairly whether the countries are doing it, and if they do deliver reforms, then they move forward. For the Western Balkans, this wasn't the case. 20 years ago, at the Thessaloniki summit, the Council of Ministers, this was an optimistic moment as well in recent history. They promised the Western Balkans that they will join the European Union. 20 years have passed. Some countries are candidate countries. Some have opened negotiations. But even Montenegro, who is the country that has made most progress in this area, has closed the last chapter in 2017. So there hasn't been any meaningful progress because the process had stalled. Bosnia was asked to fulfill conditions before it was considered for candidacy. Never happened before. Kosovo is not a candidate country. Spain said no to Kosovo because 5 EU members don't recognize Kosovo, and thus the EU cannot move this process forward. Now, we've come to this point, as Johannes Lindner said, with Ukraine, this conversation is opening up again. Now, what does this mean for all of the countries who want to join the EU? And there's ideas being thrown around. It's the 20-year anniversary of Thessaloniki, so all the think tanks have been thinking up ways how to move this process forward. Some say that maybe now we should look at more staged accession for countries, or maybe countries should join the internal market first and then look for membership later on. There's this report that came out today. I didn't read it, but I'm sure there's plenty of great idea on how to reform the institutions, the EU institutions who need to bring all these countries in. But you asked me for the vision. I want the Western Balkans to transform the way that Romania and Bulgaria and Slovakia have transformed. And yes, I can maybe see how you would say, well, they haven't done enough, but they've, compared to where they were before, these countries have jumped so high. And this is what I want to see for the Western Balkans. I think to do this, opening up negotiations with all countries is essential. Then let countries deliver on reforms, and then decide who is getting in when, depending on how the reform process goes. But for that to happen, this needs to be a credible process with membership prospects at the end of it.
Herr Lindner, yeah, there is a feeling of dynamism in business words that is very lacking in the former founding countries of this of union. How do you react to this both presentations? And can the candidate countries give us ambition that we sometimes lack? How can Europe reinvent itself as a part of the enlargement process? I would like to quote Emmanuel Macron on his speech of Bratislava in May. We need a great moment of theoretical and geopolitical clarification of our European Union. Do you agree with that? What do you think about that?
First of all, I think what is very clear is that because of the security situation and because of the change in the global order, we have to think as a continent and have to give a clear prospect to these countries, either enlargement or a close association, and a close partnership. And I'm saying this not just for the accession countries, but also for Great Britain. So we need to think much more of a partnership as the continent as a whole. Now, I'm in favor of enlargement, but at the same time, I think there are three important elements. First is that we ourselves have certain elements in place that ensure that the enlargement is not bringing in some divides and some new culture into the union that could make the union explode. And I think here, and that's not just an issue only for the accession countries, it's also an issue of the conflict that we have in the union itself, and that's the rule of law. So I think we need an operational instrument on rule of law because we should not compromise on certain values and structures within the union. The second in this is the differentiation possibility, so that we could have possibilities for some to go ahead if others do not want to go ahead. And this is a bit linked to the general point of using the enlargement also as an opportunity to review some of the stuff that we have already sort of developed further, but have never ever updated in the treaty. And here I find, again, this point of Draghi a good one. I mean, I agree with Anton Hofreiter's pragmatism to a certain extent, but at the same time, and maybe that's a bit our role from a think tank perspective, also to say, look, if the head of the central bank, the former head of the central bank says, we cannot again do it through technocratic integration, let's take this up and discuss how we do enlargement, and also look back and say, we've done now two important crises, the Euro crisis and the pandemic, with this treaty. We need an update of that. We've done a lot of stuff with Karlsruhe here in Germany at the neck, sometimes used, sometimes abused, whatever. But we need an update. And so let's also take that enlargement as an opportunity to update the treaty for the sake, not just the enlargement, but the sake of having a good institutional framework.
So we need politics. We need politics, definitely. We need less bureaucracy, less, we need more political, taking a risk of going further. How do you react to that? Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I totally agree with it. But for me, it's not something we do this one or the other. I always would argue we move on the pragmatic way and try, on the other hand, for example, try to make good changes of the treaty. But I fear sometimes if we say too clearly, we have to change the treaty to move on for anything else, everybody who wants to stop moving on uses it as an excuse for doing nothing. Because of this, I say, yes, the best way would be to change the treaty, to have a better institutional framework, to have in nearly all areas qualified majorities or even simple majorities, but it can easily be used for just one country to stop the whole process. And because of this, I would always say, yes, we tried, and still we use the pragmatic way, because if this is not successfully, it's not the second best option to do nothing, but then to do a lot of pragmatic, sometimes not so convenient, sometimes complicated, sometimes on the first moment thinking, oh, what they are doing, solutions, because if you have a so clear-cut path, which is so simply to see, it's for the opponents so easily to block this clear-cut path. And because of this, we have also to use difficulty and not so logical paths through the undergrowth and using machete. I don't know how it's called in English. Mercator to go through. And for the you are totally right that the enlargement process needs trust again, because nobody trusts the enlargement process anymore. Maybe it's Ukrainians, because they think they are so powerful and their machete is so heavy that they will force their way in. But I'm not sure if they really know how difficult it is to force its way into the European Union. But for the smaller Western Balkan countries, it's really not good. And I think a stage way of accession would much better, because you have progress and then you get directly a reward. Because if it's so long time and you have to reform and reform and reform, and it's so complicated and so hard, and of course you get the rewards of the reforms itself, because most of the reforms are good for the countries itself, but you have only from the European Union the big reward of full membership. There are so many steps which can, from for example, roaming. If the Western Balkans country would be included into the roaming system, it would be great for many people. So many people have families in Kosovo and Germany and Austria, in Albania and Italy, and so or Horizon. Or if Montenegro would not have needed China for building roads, it would be much easier for Montenegro. And if you are very far on your way, that you can be a member of the internal market and get the 4 freedoms of market, and still you are not a full member. And even if you're a full member, there are ideas possible. For example, you could say to every new member, okay, now you can become a new member, but we still have the problem with veto. So you have to sign a very, very clear treaty that you will not use your veto possibility as long as the veto exists. And I think if the country has to decide, I can become a full member, but with one right less than the older full members, I'm not allowed to use the veto, I think the countries will decide I will become a full member. It's not really fair, but it's better than doing nothing. So I always advocate, yes, we try the way with changing the treaty, but on the other hand, we will have very creative ideas to move forward, and sometimes to move forward not on the simple, clear-cut path, because on the simple, clear-cut path, always trees are falling from the left and from the right, because it's so easy to throw trees in this clear-cut path for our opponents.
Yeah, thank you. I think you have a good point, because there are different approaches on membership in Europe, and some have been discussed not later than on Monday. Another report on enlargement, this time by Baltic, Polish, Nordic and Croatian political scientists, hosted by Lithuania, recommend that the arrival of new members should not be conditional on institutional reform, because your arguments, because it could be used as a pretext to bury enlargement once again. How do you react to that? How do you see there are different possibilities to approach, different approaches to membership? What do you need to do until you have the full membership? How do you see that from your point of view?
Personally, and again, this is something I will be looking at more in detail during the year that I will be doing this research at Hertie, but I think that having either a stage approach or joining internal market first and then full membership, anything that moves away from this goal of EU membership, this process that's been well established, that works well, My fear is that the difficult reforms need to happen in the countries that are trying to join. And keep in mind, I talked about the Western Balkans, but Ukraine is at war, and getting a country at war to also focus on delivering on reforms is going to be very difficult. So to have, to say that we're doing this for now and there's only an association or only an internal market might not actually achieve the goals of fully transforming these countries. Again, Ukraine may benefit from joining the internal market. It produces a lot. It has a lot of benefits to join this market directly. The Western Balkans are not as wealthy in that respect. Serbia, who's a front runner in economic development, exports to the EU in the value of 18 billion euros, but imports from the EU in the value of 24 billion euros, and this gap keeps increasing because it is just not able to compete. What the Western Balkans needs is slightly different than what Ukraine needs, even though the entire area needs this prospect to join the EU. Maybe one final note. The EU has been negotiating a sort of a final solution between Kosovo and Serbia. Serbia not recognizing Kosovo as a state, Kosovo being stuck because of this and other non-recognitions. This has been going on since 2010, 2011. No progress has been made precisely because there is no membership perspective that is real. It's been talked about, but the steps to there are not clear. So, peace and stability, economic development, overall transformation of these regions are essential. And the only way, a paved way to do this is the process that's already established, which is getting the countries to transform, deliver reforms, and join the EU.
So some disappointment. We are, Mr. Linda, we are talking, so Europe is talking now about 2030 for enlargement as a real possibility. Is that credible? Is that something we should talk about, having a clear date, or you would prefer to talk about reforms before?
Only very briefly. I think it's very important, and that's why I've advocated for the 2028 to have a focus of when the EU itself wants to upgrade it, both on the budget and institutional side. And that's why I think it's good to have a clear date. I mean, I understand Anton Hofreiter's pragmatism, and in the end, the discussion on institutional reform is one where we should try to see what we can do without treaty change. I would agree, but at the same time, if you opt too early for not a treaty change upgrade, or not for the real treaty change, then you will be very low in your ambition. So I think 28 as a focus point is something that we also should commit the new Commission and to have debated in the European Parliament election now is very, very important to get the EU in a better shape. Now, if then in parallel also there is a commitment on the side of the accession countries and you need that anchor, maybe you need a date. But I'm personally not fully convinced whether we need to commit to a date. But I think what is more important to have a credible process where the accession countries have the feeling that they are actually making progress. And as I said, also at the same time that we are using the prospect of the next MFF to upgrade our own institutional budgetary means.
Short reaction before I will open the... No, it's time now to open the discussion to the audience. I know very well that Federico prepared some questions. Federico, you're here. Please take a mic, and we are happy to hear your question.
Thank you very much for the floor. Hope you can all hear me. My name is Federico Campatelli. I'm a board member of the Future EU Club here at the Hertie School. It's a newly founded club, and we aim to be the doorstep for all the Hertie community to connect with EU policy and EU issues. Now, getting to the question, I would like to address it to Mr. Shahini, and you really exposed a commendable vision for what the enlargement could look like from outside the European Union. So you really explored how the prospective membership can really give an impetus for reform in accession countries. And as identified before, there is a lot of reform that needs to be made inside the EU. I would like to point out especially about the rule of law concerns that have been present in the EU for over 10 years now. There is renewed political momentum at this point, exactly because of enlargement, and that can definitely be used to bring about a change in the situation with regarding to the rule of law. But what would be the most logical steps, and how could this momentum be used in this case? How could this moment for enlargement be used to address the rule of law concerns?
Yes, thank you for that question. Of course, it is one of the fundamentals as well that it's called in sort of the requirements that the countries have to fulfill before they are ready to even sort of close chapters and move forward in the accession process. I still believe that the best way to get countries to reform is to have a credible membership perspective. That doesn't mean that countries join in 5 years or 10 years or in 15 years. It just means that they believe that once they actually do the difficult reforms, they will be able to join. Currently, the situation is as such that none of the countries in the region have the slightest sort of ray of optimism that they can join the EU. That's why the reforms have stopped. Maybe just to very briefly talk about how this process works. So member states decide, they have to vote on candidacy status. So the Commission does the screening process, looks at how the country is doing in 33 chapters or 33 areas. And once they send this report to the Council then votes on candidacy status. And then they vote on a negotiating framework. It's again, the list of conditions that the country have to fulfill. And then they vote on closing each one of the 33 chapters, which are now clustered in clusters. And then they vote once more on the treaty. And in each one of these 4 steps, each member state can block the process, which was the case with Macedonia and Greece, and now Bulgaria and Macedonia. North Macedonia, yes. Basically, in order to move the reforms forward, the process has to be credible. And I truly believe that while the EU is reforming itself, the Western Balkans should keep up with the reforms that they have to deliver. But for that to happen, all chapters should be opened in negotiation. And this could be a good initial sign that this is a process that will be rewarded should countries actually fulfill conditions. In the meantime, the EU can have the very important conversations as to how to make decisions about not just further enlargement, but all issues that pertain to the EU, and who will be represented in the parliament, and how many commissioners will there be. All important questions that are important to be solved before the enlargement, but not before the reforms are reinvigorated in the region.
Yeah, I see another question and 2 questions. Yeah.
Good evening. Thank you very much for an engaging panel. My name is Nicholas. I study public policy here. I have 1 question to Johannes Lindner and 1 question to Beza Shahini. To Johannes, I read a brilliant piece today from Benjamin Brown. He's also associated with Hertie School. And in that, he argues that the central bank, aka the European Central Bank, has a very fundamental role in financial planning. And he argues that we need to socialize central bank planning system that is currently privatized and geared towards expanding the financialization of our financial system. So perhaps you could comment on this. And then to you, Ms. Shahini, I listened with curiosity to your answer just now, and the way I understand you is that you deem that the responsibility of accession is on the European Union to wield the carrot and the incentives to the prospective member states. From my understanding, the responsibility is exactly the other way around. Johannes Lindner pointed out that we have grave difficulties and tensions within the European Union as it is. And from my perspective, the priority list should be maintaining and expanding, obviously, social cohesion within the existing union until we get a regulatory framework that allows for smooth accession. So perhaps you could comment on why you deem the responsibility different from the way I deem it. Thank you.
Okay, so a long time ago in a country far away, a gentleman who hadn't yet joined Facebook said that the ever closer union wasn't working out for every country. This is Nick Clegg trying to handle Brexit from within the UK. So I'm excited about the idea of the multi-tier system. I can see that some countries will always have different kinds of tensions and have to be closer to different neighbors, but it would be nice if they had some kind of role within the EU. But I'm worried about how it is if we put requirements on joining members that some of the current members are not achieving. And if this is one of the reasons nobody's really explained the side for why there's another side about reform first. So as part of the point that we need to not only be able to promote people, but also to relegate them. We need to make a clear path up and down, in and out from the center, so that it's less disruptive if there's left. Not that it's less costly. It should be incredibly costly to leave. But is this what the controversy is? And secondly, no one has mentioned Turkey. So I was wondering if someone could also mention Turkey.
Okay, on the question of the central bank, maybe 3 points. The first, central bank independence is a very important good, and I think we should not be too quick in throwing this out and in abolishing this. Central banks across the world in the last crisis, a crisis where we had low inflation, in fact deflationary tendencies, played a huge role and expanded their balance sheet. And the ECB was not completely dissimilar to what the Bank of England did and what the Fed did. Now that we have high inflation rates, you see how the ECB is going in the other direction, reducing its balance sheet, using the interest rate hikes to a degree that people find, oof, it's now painful. But it's also a sort of natural process then that the balance sheet shrinks in these periods. And so in that respect, I think it's a pendulum that is now natural with the cycle of the economy. First point. Second point is that the quote that I gave from Henrik is actually much more beautiful than the one sentence that I gave from the Spiegel. And I would really recommend to read that Spiegel article. It's one of the last pieces that he wrote. And it says a hegemon has two tools, coercion, Zwang, or generosity. And he said the Germans very used coercion in the Euro crisis by telling everyone what they should do. And they showed generosity by letting the ECB do the risk sharing. And came across as not very solidaric and a believer of an ordoliberal religion. Now, that's a caricature and maybe oversimplification. But what is important, and it's the difference to the pandemic that is telling here, is that, of course, with the lack of a big budget, sorry to come back to the budget again, but with the lack of a big budget, you, of course, have much more stabilization put on the onus of the central bank than if the stabilization is done through a fiscal capacity. And so, of course, some of the big role that the ECB played in the Euro crisis is also to the fact that we don't have a complete fiscal union yet. And then a final point, which is about financialization and some of the criticism that Benjamin does. This links back to a very good panel that I think, Cornelia, you introduced at the time and you were part of when we had Moritz Schullerek here, which is the general question of whether some of the promises of financialization that kicked in the 70s and 80s has been broken and should be revisited. But there, I think macroprudential instruments, banking regulations, supervisions are the instruments that should be in place and are in fact important in order to prevent another bubble bursting and financialization leading to boom and bust.
The responsibility for reforms is absolutely squarely on the countries that want to exceed. There's no doubt about that. What I'm trying to argue here tonight is that to undergo such difficult and expensive reforms that countries have to undergo in order to be ready to join the EU, there needs to be a credible perspective that this will actually lead to membership. Look, in the Ministry of Education, I take this example when I teach policy cycles, right? We had to make a very simple decision that was all within the ministry. We didn't even have to coordinate with other ministries to expand the number of categories of students who receive free textbooks. Everyone agreed within the ministry. The financial department was okay. We had the money. The legal department was okay. It was easy to do. Yet it took us 6 months, and we almost missed the beginning of the school year because we still needed to coordinate and get the right wording in place and see how legislatively this could happen. Now, imagine if you have to do this about everything, fiscal rules and food safety and procurement, different education programs that you have to be able to apply for. To do all of this, there needs to be a credible EU perspective, because some of these reforms are not actually in the immediate short interest of the people or the businesses. To make food production meet the highest EU standards of quality and of the packaging and the food safety and all of that, it's super costly, and not always do businesses have in their interest to do it, and they don't necessarily, they can't necessarily sell their products in a region that is much poorer than the EU. So in this respect, the reforms must happen in the country. They are very painful, and in order for them to take place, there needs to be a credible process that looks at the reforms, whether they're being delivered, and then rewards countries based on that. That is not quick. It doesn't happen overnight. And while the EU issues are solved here, the Western Balkans and Ukraine and all the other countries have to do their reforms, but there needs to be a credible process for that.
Another question? Two questions?
Thank you. Goran Budiski, Open Society Foundations. One question for Besa. Besa, sitting here in Berlin, and you will soon learn the neighborhoods, nobody expects that Neukölln and Marzahn will negotiate an entry deal in EU. That's what we expect from Montenegro, because roughly that's the population of Montenegro. If you look around, people are smiling because nobody expects Neukölln and Marzahn to have the capacity to do that. So my question to you is, are there any efforts for a fundamental rethinking of what these reforms are about and the EU accession process? Because if you can expect Ukraine, that is a big, sizable country, also with the potential to build capacity to negotiate, can we also argue or think of a radically changed model? Because only 100,000 pages and counting of the acquis means, in principle, 1 page per 6 inhabitants of Montenegro. And I let you do the count. For Johannes, I have a question more about the money. I love that you talk about the money, and let's bring the euro. Mr. Macron likes to talk about multi-speed Europe. Actually, we have already multi-speed Europe. On the euro, we have Poland, Hungary, examples of countries that willingly have chosen not to introduce it. That's like a supermarket approach. What if this is used in your institutional reforms. And again, I ask you for a bit of a more sort of broader ideas. What if this is used in order not to create so much the multi-speed euro, but to actually to create a creative choices of opt-ins and opt-outs, which will not be based on supermarket, but actually on certain conditionality. You're not part of the euro, then we know that you cannot do all the stuff that you want, but it could go more. And can we also link this with other money? I read proposal after proposal, all the money that we talk about are budgetary funding. Nobody talks about investments. What about the investments? This is actually where the money is. You know, the turnover between Germany and Poland increased last year 16.9%. In the year when the rule of law was at the ultimate low, 12.5% with Hungary. And nobody talks about reforms where we talk also, don't get me wrong, I don't want to sanction private money investment, but I also believe that if we don't talk about where the real money of investment is inside of the EU, we will not be able to come to the budget, because that's just a small portion of the big pie that actually EU produces in its GDP. Sorry, I threw a lot of questions, but I hope they will stimulate the debate. Thank you.
Frau Hassel, you have a question too, please? We have a question in the front row. Thank you.
Yeah, Anke Hassel, I teach here at the Hertie School of Public Policy, and I have a question to Anton Hofreiter, who I found refreshingly pragmatic about the whole exercise, no question about it. And it actually rings a bell, because if we think back to the 1990s, we were in a similar situation, because we also proceeded with enlargement and deepening at the same time. We prepared for monetary union at the same time when we opened up to the Eastern European countries. And that, led to problems that Johannes then pointed out and Henrik realized early on. But it also was driven by a new geopolitical situation. And I think a lot of it was responses to geopolitics. The falling of the Iron Curtain was certainly one of it, but also the opening up of the Eastern Asian markets, the new rise of globalization, presented new opportunities, and the euro was really an important mechanism to get there. So geopolitics is driving this, and I think now we're also in a new situation where we have a lot of geopolitics. It's not just Ukraine, but it's also China. It's also a new era of globalization, deglobalization, sort of difficult trade relationships, et cetera, et cetera. So, and I expect the same thing to happen, actually. As you, I think enlargement will happen, deepening will happen, and it will happen in ways we cannot anticipate, because we don't know what will happen in Ukraine, and we don't know how long the war will take, et cetera, et cetera. So my question to you is sort of being sympathetic to the pragmatism. Do you think we need any roadmap in this process when we are sort of using our machete to find sort of ways around the treaties and, opening loopholes here and sort of turning a corner there and sort of going zigzag, et cetera? Is that really just sort of very spontaneous responses to current situations, or would it be helpful if Johannes draws up a roadmap, with the Jacques Delors Center and says, this is really what we should do with the budget in 5 years' time?
I would like to start with this question, the political aspect. It's a refreshing question. Are we in such a moment?
I think, yes, we are in such a moment, because there has been no trust in the enlargement process, because, for example, France despite Thessaloniki 2003, they don't want enlargement. It was that simple, and Germany decided it's not so important. So it just not happened. It has nothing to do with institutional reforms and things like this. This was just a political decision and because of this, what I mean with political leadership, the problem was that Germany and other important European countries allowed Bulgaria with ridiculous questions to bilateralize the enlargement process and put so much pressure on Northern Macedonia. It's just ridiculous. And I'm sure that Germany, who told Greece how they should do their pension reforms, could explain to Bulgaria, if you put enough pressure on it, to stop this bilateralization. So, in my opinion, it's a question of political will. And because of China and Russia are doing such amount of interesting things in Western Balkan, and Russia attacked Ukraine and is currently attacking Moldova in a hybrid way. We don't see it this way, and we always can explain that we have no war with Russia. Of course, we have no war directly with Russia, but Russia is attacking Europe in many aspects. So it's not our decision. Even if we try to ignore it, it happens. And because of all this, what's happening now, I think the political will has changed. Now we have again the Berlin process, the geopolitical aspects brought France to be very in favor of enlargement. Germany is delivering weapons, still too reluctant, but is delivering weapons, which is, I'm very happy about this, but I think not everybody has realized how fundamentally things has changed within Germany. Now we are delivering main battle tanks into a war in Eastern Europe. If anybody has explained this to me 5 years ago, I would say it will never, never, never happen. But it happened. And so I think it's mostly a question of political will, and I think ideas, and especially good ideas, logical ideas and visions, helps that the political will which now exists finds better ways through the jungle. And that, I think, is the role of all these ideas to focus the existing political will on things that in the end really works. Is it more or less understandable?
Thank you very much. On the question, or maybe on the past question, the other question, do you want to react?
Yes, well, Goran asked about negotiating capacity of Montenegro, a very small Balkan country. Look, negotiations in this process is not the right word. The countries don't negotiate. They have to take the acquis as it's given by the Commission and have to take in the law, and they have to do the reforms, and they have. So I don't think Montenegro has had the opportunity to negotiate anything. It is actually the front runner in the Balkans. It's the country that has closed 3 chapters now, and none of the other countries have gone that far. But I see your point. Like I know where you're getting at. Croatia is the last country to join. It's a Western Balkan country who's now moved away from the rest of us development-wise. They have not seen the type of economic development that Romania and Slovakia and Bulgaria have seen from enlargement, and it has to do less with the EU membership process and more to do with where, what's happening in the continent and with the financial crisis and where financially these whole institutions are. So yes, this is a question for the Western Balkans as well. For the rest, will it have such an economic impact as it did for the 2007 wave? Maybe not, and we need to think, is it still worth it? I believe it's still worth it to go through this process. This transformation is essential to get to, better societies, better countries. Regardless of this, I think it's still something that the countries should and can work on.
Johannes?
Yes, we're anyway over the time, so I'll be super brief. And if I may also thank Anton Hofreiter for for the, in a way, plea to come up with further ideas to Beza and myself and to many of us here to help you fight the jungle. And just quickly, as a reply to Goran's question, I think operationalization of rule of law is very key, and I think we're not there yet. And secondly, you need the threat of differentiation also in order to focus minds. I think that we've seen that in the past. And it's interesting, differentiation has not, besides the euro, lately not been used so much, but it's important to say we can go ahead. And that's one of the key functions that differentiation offers. Thank you. And thank you to you for moderating this panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We are reaching the end of our debate. Do you want to say a closing word, or are we? Maybe I would like to ask you a question, a point about the French-German relationship. We are here celebrating Henrik Enderlein, and I wanted to ask you something because Robert Habeck gave a speech to German diplomats saying the French-German relationship is a polarity. Which should be understood as the fact that we don't agree on anything. Maybe you can say a word, trusting word, about the future of this relationship.
I think this relationship is totally crucial, and it's not in the best shape. We have especially big problems with industrial politics, budget politics, energy politics, and so on. And maybe Scholz and Macron not always have the same opinion on everything. To frame it very, I don't know the English word for it. I'm sorry. But as today, the German-French expert group has proposed its report, and the two state ministers for Europe affairs and the foreign ministers and also the economic ministers, I have the feeling that we work better together than it seems, but we have also in several aspects very different interests and very different ideas in fields which are very important in the moment, like industrial politics, budget or energy. But I think the geopolitical pressure is so high on Europe that we are just forced to work better together. I think many of the problems, if you look back now, yes, we had the euro crisis, and so things had been always complicated, but I think the pressure is so much higher now that things like we have done to the Western Balkan countries, just to ignore it and say it's not so important and the French don't want, the Germans, well, in process, we just forget about it, that I think such big mistakes will not happen again because the pressure now is too high. And I think about several things we don't have talked today, but we have to do more, is to learn to fight not only the external enemies of Europe and democracy, but also to learn better to fight the internal enemies. For example, I just spoke yesterday with people from France, with members of parliament, and they fear Le Pen will be the next French president, and they really fear it. And then we have totally different discussions here. So I think beside now political will to reform and to enlarge, one of the most important things for Europe is to learn to fight its external enemies and its internal enemies. And I say enemies, my English is not the best, but what enemies means, I know. So I think we have really to fight our internal enemies, and the most dangerous internal enemies are the right-wing extremists in the moment, and we have to learn to fight them.
Thank you. So there is reason for hope. Thank you very much for your attention and have a very wonderful evening. Bye-bye.